Welcome to a special episode of Dynamics of Leadership. The following interview is part of our Leaders in Conversation series. Today, I'm happy to bring you an interview with Todd Zimendinger. Todd is the principal at Rockport Elementary School in Rockport, Massachusetts. Rockport, as many of you know, is a place near and dear to me. Not only is it a place where I spent the majority of my youth, but it's also where I raised my children, and they both went to Rockport Public Schools, K through 12, and we're at Rockport Elementary School. Todd and I are chatting today because he recently participated in the Navigating Challenging Dialogue Leadership Certification Training and had some responses and reactions to his learning and some ways that he's incorporated it back into his work. And so I wanted to go ahead and ask him some questions about that and have folks really get a sense of how navigating challenging dialogue can apply in the public education setting. Hey, Todd, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with you. Tell me a little bit about how you experienced the leadership workshop that you participated in.
Well, for me, it was really an eye-opening experience that I initially engaged in because it certainly is a huge part of my practice. Navigating challenging conversations is probably 90% of my job. And so because it has such an impact on my ability as a principal to effectively communicate with my staff, to work through the change process, to work with students and parents, it seemed like a natural fit as a skill for me to develop further.
So tell me a little bit about how you got into even becoming a school principal. What was that journey like for you and what brought you there?
Yeah, it was an interesting journey for sure. I started out at Ohio State as a business major. And it wasn't until I had spent about a year working in Disney World as an intern where I really sort of started to figure out that I wanted to get into education and teaching, and had the opportunity to work on some projects at Disney that were educationally sort of connected. And when I finished school, I ended up teaching for a year in a residential day school for behavior students while I was finishing my licensure requirements. And then I spent 10 years teaching as a history teacher at a vocational high school, and a year in my first administrative job as the curriculum and assessment coordinator at a urban school just outside of Boston, and then moved to Rockport in the middle high school as an assistant principal. And then 4 years ago, shifted over here to the elementary school. So it's been an interesting journey with a lot of different venues and situations that have been proven to be really useful for me along the way.
Wow, that is fascinating. I heard Disney and I heard alternative or residential school setting, vocational school setting, high school, middle school level, and now here at the elementary. That's pretty amazing. Tell me, when you were in the Navigating Challenging Dialogue workshop, what kind of stood out for you as things that you wanted to bring back to your school culture?
A lot of things. The things that sort of struck me, I guess, in the moment of being there was certainly the importance of the increased self-awareness and having a better understanding of how and why I respond during different situations and how I can help my staff in understanding how they can have better self-awareness through coaching. Mm-hmm. Certainly the tools that we learned about when handling the unexpected challenging dialogues, even the simple sort of physical things, the breathing, the calming techniques, and being able to put yourself in a mental state to be in a position to have a productive conversation with somebody as opposed to sending off signals that perhaps are not advantageous to moving forward with the conversation. The other big thing I thought was just being super conscious of the energy that you bring into the room every time. That for me was in my role can sometimes be a challenging thing if I'm not really conscious of it because of the volume of things that happen, and learning how to shift staff, for example, when moving into a staff meeting after school, to help them transition into conversations and be able to transition and focus on problem solving as opposed to talking about what happened during the school day or those sort of things. And the biggest thing for me was having a really concrete process to be able to go through the dialogue, which at first for me was somewhat clumsy, having to sort of sit with this sheet in front of me off to the side where nobody could see I'm trying to sort of navigate through it, which I do still do sometimes in conversations that I know are going to be super complicated. And I think through those steps. But now when I'm not necessarily prepared for the conversation or I'm in a teacher's room on the fly, I have the ability to provide some structure to the conversation and get to solutions using the framework that was provided. So there was a lot that was learned. And there was also, I thought, a lot of realizations that came afterwards. It's sort of reflecting on it, because it is a lot. Reflecting on it afterwards, there were certainly a fair number of things that really sunk in for me.
Yeah, it's kind of the workshop that keeps on giving. I mean, one person said to me, once some of these things come into your consciousness, you just can never look at any interaction the same way again. And
no question about that.
Have you gotten any feedback from people around you, your staff or colleagues, teammates, even people in your personal life on shifts that they've seen? Are people aware of it?
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly the people that I work closest with within my job, sort of administratively, I think were the ones that were the most, because I see them the most, interact with them the most, were the ones that I think provided the most feedback on it. And I think a lot of it is just the ability now to sort of have very clearly defined conversations with the ability to remove the emotions and the flawed facts and everything out of them, where having those conversations before took a fair amount longer than they do now. And also, I think, has resulted in people feeling like they're being heard more, because the onus is on the staff member to provide the information and the context, and for me to be more of sort of a guiding force as opposed to the leader of the conversation.
Yeah. Have you noticed any impact on your personal energy level? Stress, fatigue, any of that? Has there been any impact on that?
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, certainly having the process and the ability to control the initial emotional response from staff members has made it a lot easier. So understanding what people's triggers are, for example, and being able to sort of identify where people fall into that spectrum of their personalities has made it a lot easier to find ways to approach conversation. So it's less about being concerned about engaging in the conversation and making it productive, and more about finding a way for a staff member to be able to engage in the conversation at a place where they're comfortable with it, and understanding where they're coming from and what their fears are, or where their discomfort is likely to come from the conversation, so that those things can be, we can put them in a place to not have to be on the defensive when these conversations are being had.
Yeah, that's great. Can you see an application for educators to be able to use any of these skills in their classroom?
Yeah, no question about it. I think from both the leadership role and from the teacher role, there are a lot of things to be taken from this. And I don't know that there are many professions that face the volume of challenging conversations as school-based administrators or even teachers face. It is also one of the things that there's very little instruction or support given on. And because of how much it influences a school principal's ability to be effective, to be able to navigate change, which is always a challenge in schools and requires a lot of conversations that are difficult. Navigating very difficult parent conversations and how to get them to move sometimes and understand the school's perspective. And in the classroom, and I think that that's been the most interesting, unexpected benefit for me, is that we're still at the really early stages of working with staff on some of these concepts. But immediately I was already seeing the changes in how they interacted with their own students at times, about getting them, for example, I had a teacher that sat with me when we had a pretty significant conflict between two students, and I used this process, and she was so enamored by it that she was like, I'd really like to try this with my students at one point to help them understand really what are the core issues that we're getting at, and how are we going to resolve them. So there's a lot of benefits just from the developmental end for kids to understand, and certainly from staff to improve their, not only their interactions with principals or administrators, but their ability to interact productively with each other. And that in every school is always a challenge. And I would say all the things I've done in terms of professional development, this one had the most impact in terms of my ability to successfully sort of build skills to be a more effective leader.
Wow. You know, you and I haven't really had any opportunity to kind of debrief and talk about how you've been applying this and how you've been using it since you came to the workshop. I always joke around, I'm a recovering school administrator and worked in alternative education myself for a few years. So for me, hearing this and hearing how you've been able to disseminate this out through just by coming to the 4 days and being a really active and open participant in that workshop, I just can't even tell you what it does for my heart and my mission with this work. If there's any way that navigating challenging dialogue can have an impact on the way we work with kids, the way school environments are able to be places where people can have tough dialogues, that makes my year, I think. So I'm so thankful for that. When you think about, off the topic of navigating challenging dialogue, but when you think about some current leaders in the world who you kind of admire or look to emulate, who are some of the folks that come up for you as you're looking for guides and leaders?
Certainly going back, I guess, maybe to a still relevant, but not necessarily individual in a leadership position. But for example, I always admired so much Barack Obama and his ability to handle the pressures and stresses of the job with such a consistent approach, emotional approach, and with the ability to really maintain a focus on the ultimate goal of what he was trying to get at. And certainly politics aside and successes and failures, his demeanor and his strength as a leader was something that was, for me, was really remarkable and somebody that I certainly admired.
Yeah. He definitely had a awareness of his energy.
Yep.
And the energy that he brought to every single room. And I think also a fascinating ability to not get hooked into emotion, assumption, but to really be focused on what are the facts of the situation. And as you know, one of the mantras of navigating challenging dialogue is speaking your truth with a focus on what's in the best interest of the good of the whole.
That's right.
And I can definitely see that alignment. What might you tell other educational leaders about the benefit of navigating challenging dialogue? What might you share with someone who's wondering how it will benefit them?
I think that there's two sides to it. I think that there's sort of the practical piece of what we learned in the challenging dialogue, and that being the sort of tangible pieces and the structures that are put in place, how you can be more productive in faculty meetings and norms and those sort of procedural things that can be put into place, which are hugely helpful in providing a improved structure for those type of situations. But for me, I think it's more the philosophical shift of being able to focus on not only self-awareness, but also having a better understanding of how other people think and look at situations with a better appreciation and understanding, not making assumptions, being super conscious of the cognitive shortcuts, for example, and how other people use those, how I use those. Because in a school-based environment, conversations tend to be very brief. That's just sort of the nature of the business. It's a teacher passing 15 minutes during a prep period or lunch or whatever. So there isn't oftentimes a lot of time to have long, drawn-out conversations. So being efficient is extremely important. And it's also really important that those conversations typically end in a way that is at least productive. Mm-hmm. The teacher isn't walking away upset or not feeling heard because you may not see them again for 4 hours. And that can sometimes have some negative consequences as well. So the other thing is that it's really helped with trying to figure out the change process, because this is where a lot of our conversations have sort of come through, the change process and the school culture piece. Mm-hmm. And the change process for me, and I think for most principals, is the hardest part of being a principal, of shifting philosophies and trying to get everybody on board and moving forward with things that are sometimes mandated and sometimes are a principal's idea of doing things in new and better ways. But you can't do any of that stuff if you're not willing to engage in these kinds of conversations. And I would say it's a good, on an average day, 60% of my day is having these conversations in one way or another. And I'm still not great at it. It takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of really focusing on what you are doing and how you're feeling and being very methodical about it. And even still, you can get caught up in old bad habits and the struggles that come with being responsive to what people are saying or over emotional. But in the end, since I've attended and I've had an opportunity to practice, it's made me a better leader because my staff feels, at least the staff that I've had a chance to interact with using this, they feel like they're heard and they understand more of the need for doing things that we're doing because we're getting down to the facts and we're moving away from the emotions. We're moving away from the flawed first fact, which is oftentimes the issue, or the past experiences, which for teachers is a big deal. And then even as a teacher myself, something would come along and it'd be like, great, we're going to do this now. And we did it 10 years ago. So you have to really invest a lot of time in that. So I use it in just about every aspect of my professional life and certainly even my personal life of, I have young kids at home and I have twin 5-year-olds and a 13-year-old. So there are different levels of challenging conversations, but in the end, it's the same concept and the same skill. Or with my wife, for example, it's sometimes I go through the challenging dialogue myself and come to the conclusion that I'm actually wrong before she tells me I'm wrong. So it's been really helpful. It just requires, out of the gate, it requires a lot of focus and energy to stick with the plan and making sure that you're living up to all of the things that you've learned about.
Yeah, I think at its core, it's about self-accountability and self-leadership, right? Leading yourself first. And sometimes that's the hardest work. And the thing we least want to take a look at is ourselves. It's so much easier to look at others and try and find places to lay blame. Todd, I can't thank you enough for this conversation and for your commitment to moving, navigating challenging dialogue out into the world. For folks who want to learn more about navigating challenging dialogue or listen to some of the other interviews with folks from other industries and parts of the world, you can go to bethwanson.com and check that out. And Todd, I know that we're doing some kind of really basic level conversations about how we can support each other in this work with educational leaders. And I'm really looking forward to more of this with you. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So until next time, this is Beth with Leaders in Conversation.
For more leadership resources, including podcasts, blogs, and videos, please visit us at bethwanson.com.